Fraser Myers is the deputy editor of Spikes, good friend of the show. Fraser, my old son, how are you?
I'm doing great. All the better for being here. Thanks, Jeremy.
Good man. Thanks for coming on. I find myself cast in the role of almost pantomime villain every day because I'm turning into a man who's getting angrier by the minute. You might have heard yesterday that Vauxhall has shut down its Luton plant of electrical vans, blaming it 100% today on the government's policy of chasing net zero targets. Now, anybody like me who says, I'm sure there's a problem with the climate, right? But I just think there are more important things. And I think that virtue signalling is becoming so huge in politics and it's making us miss the things that really matter. Where do you stand on this, Fraser?
No, I agree with you entirely. There are many, many more important things than the climate, and the net zero policy is crazy, particularly in relation to cars. So there's a specific part of net zero called the zero emissions mandate, and that's what this relates to. And it was passed early this year by the Conservative government, but inherited by Labour. Labour was actually very keen on it. They were saying they actually want to, accelerate the transition to electric cars, bring in 100% electric cars by 2030 instead of 2035. So both parties have their fingerprints on it, but Labour are keener on it than the Conservatives. And actually what it means is, this is how crazy it is. It's almost like a kind of Stalinist quota system, where this year car manufacturers have to sell 22% of all the cars they sell have to be electric. 10% of all vans have to be electric. Now, normally in a free country, you've never heard of a policy like this. You have to sell this amount of goods or you will be fined. And the fines are enormous. The fines are in the thousands of pounds for each petrol car that they sell above their allotted quota. And the idea is that every year, the quota for petrol cars will get smaller and the quota for electric cars gets bigger. Now, you might think the obvious snag is that this only applies to manufacturers in Britain. So if you want to sell petrol cars to the UK from outside, you're not penalised. But if you make cars in Britain, like Vauxhall do in Luton, like many other manufacturers do across the UK, then you're penalised by this target and you're forced to sell the requisite number of electric cars and vans. And there are good reasons why the public aren't buying electric cars and vans.
Well, this is what I wanted to say, because Ford have come out today and has called on the government to say, listen, if you're going to go down this route, you need to introduce incentives to encourage drivers to buy cars because, hey, guess what, Starmer, you plonker? Nobody really wants to buy an electric car. That's the truth. So this great quest, and we're going to end up back where we are with so much under this government, where it's become a nanny state, and as you correctly said, we're going to be told we have to, and if we don't, we're going to be punished for it. It's like being back at school, man. Yeah,
I mean, look, electric cars are fine, but they're not as good often, or they're much more expensive than regular cars. They also have a lot less range. Depending on where you live, you might not be able to charge it very easily. It's completely rational for members of the public to say, I don't fancy an electric car.
No, it's not, because the government don't agree. It's not up to you. Don't be so unfair that people can't make their own minds up. What sort of society are you talking about, man? That would be a free society. Talking of which, tell me what you make of the story I just let go. Let me play a clip. This is Tahir Ali, Birmingham Moseley MP, who this afternoon has asked Sir Keir Starmer, God, we're harping back to the 80s now, he thinks that there should be a bill prohibiting the desecration of religious texts and the prophets of the Abrahamic religions. Have a listen to Tahir Ali this afternoon, for God's sake.
November marks Islamophobia Awareness Month. Last year, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution condemning the desecration of religious texts, including the Quran, despite opposition from the previous government. Acts of such mindless desecration only serve to fuel division and hatred within our society. Will the Prime Minister commit to introducing measures to prohibit the desecration of all religious texts and the prophets of the Abrahamic religions?
Well, can I agree with him that desecration is awful and I think should be condemned across the House? We are, as I said before, Mr. Speaker, committed to tackling all forms of hatred and division, including, of course, Islamophobia in all of its forms.
Fraser, call me old-fashioned and I'll be pulled apart for this, but there's two things I want to say. He failed to mention that we're a country of free speech, and why can't I fly my St George's flag outside my house then?
Well, I wouldn't say that you're the old-fashioned one here. I think that MP is pretty old-fashioned. What century does he think this is, trying to introduce a blasphemy law? It's not the 7th century or something? I don't know. And it's hard to know which is worse, actually. Is it that you have this Labour MP proposing a blasphemy law, trying to take us back to the Dark Ages? Or is it Keir Starmer, who didn't flat out refuse to, or didn't dismiss it as outrageous, crazy, a bizarre, totally medieval infringement on free speech? You know, obviously, it isn't big or clever to go around tearing up copies of the Quran or something like that. And that would be quite a mean-spirited thing to do. But in a free society, you have a right to do these things, just as you would have a right to burn a flag that you don't approve of. Those are expressions. They might not be nice expressions, but they're expressions nonetheless that should be protected by the law, not clamped down on by the law. And to be honest, I think it says a lot about where Keir Starmer stands on this issue. We know that the Labour Party is interested in tightening up rules around Islamophobia. They say they don't want to bring in an Islamophobia law, but there might be certain rules. People who actually work in the public sector, you might be constrained from saying certain things about Islam. That's really deeply, deeply chilling, because it basically says that there's, a whole religion that you're not allowed to talk about, a whole way of life that you're not allowed to talk about, that you're not allowed to criticize. We don't want people to be racist about Muslims, and when they are, we should speak out against it, and we should stand up.
But let me, I completely agree with you, but it has to be across the board. So we go back to those riots. They were called far right. I have no time for that woman that was disgusting and rude about the Muslim community. But I would have thought that our justice system would have said, there's a prime example, I said this yesterday, of a woman who should be given community service to spend time with the Muslim community and understand some of the good things about the Muslim community and stop judging them by a few activists. But no, she goes to jail for 15 months, and Keir Starmer wonders why people rise up and go, hold on a minute, so Hugh Edwards and his fellow paedophiles are walking the streets and she's behind bars, for God's sake. It doesn't make any sense. It's always one way nowadays in this country, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's extraordinary, the difference between, the way, as you said, with the Hugh Edwards case, jail for speech crimes, but, a slap on the wrist for essentially, not quite sex crimes, but you know what I mean? It beggars belief that there could be such a differential treatment for those things. And you're right, it does go one way politically as well, because I suspect that if you, said something outrageous, but it came from a different perspective. I mean, there was an example, for instance, of a trans activist who, got up at a rally and talked about slitting the throats of feminists who are gender critical. That was met with a slap on the wrist. That person wasn't sent to jail for inciting violence. Whether you agree with that or not, I think we should be really, really robust in what free speech we protect, really clear that, even outrageous statements shouldn't land people in jail, but there is clearly a double standard at play there.
I completely agree. Just before we go, so we've talked about electric vehicles, and these people are responding straight away because it winds the hell out of them, the green thing. You wrote an article, did you not, about Labour's green war on the working class. Fill us in, my friend.
Yeah, I think it's not just the electric vehicles issue. I think the whole net zero issue is effectively a war on the working class. It's not just putting up prices of the kind of goods we need, whether it's cars or, you're going to have to replace your boiler with a heat pump, but also it's completely devastating to industry. What we're seeing now is the green deindustrialization of Britain. So it's not just Vauxhall that is closing its factories because of net zero. There's also the Port Talbot Steelworks in Wales. There's the Grangemouth oil refinery in Scotland. Scotland's last oil refinery is closing. It represents 4% of Scotland's GDP, and it's going to shut down because of Labour's war on North Sea oil and gas. When there's an option between, you would hope that a Labour Party worth its name, when faced with the option of, do we save working class jobs or do we follow this net zero dogma, you'd hope they'd stand up for the working class. But they're so wedded to the green agenda, they're completely oblivious to the damage that it's doing.
I completely agree. Fraser Myers, thank you so much indeed. Sorry, somebody was talking to me. I really appreciate you being on.